Good morning. My name is Shlomo Brom. We are starting the panel on Russia in the Middle Eastern politics. In this panel, of course, we wish to learn about the Russian policies in the Middle East when it concerns the different conflicts, the different arenas. We wish not only to understand the policies, but we wish to understand what drives these policies. Common wisdom is that Russia's policies in the Middle East are an extension of its global competition with the United States and with the West in general. But there is also a question, are there specific interests of Russia in the Middle East? What are these interests and how they affect the policies? Are the policies successful? Is Russia achieving what it is wishing to achieve? Everyone agrees that Russia succeeded in resuming its position as a significant player in the Middle East. And I think that is something that we can appreciate, taking into account how much it succeeded to achieve with very little resources. That was quite impressive. But how it is going to affect the future of its relationship in the Middle East. So in this panel we have a combination of Russian experts and experts that specialize on issues that concerns our region. The first speaker is Dr. Elena Suponina. She is an advisor to the director of the Russian Institute for Strategic Studies, RASS, and previously was the director and founder of the Middle Eastern and Asian Center at the RISS. She is also a political analyst at the Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the Kremlin. The second one will be Dr. Witold Rodkiewicz. He is an analyst for the Center of Eastern Studies in Warsaw. He also teaches courses on Russian foreign policy and Russian and Soviet history at the Center for East European University of Warsaw. The third one will be our Ms. Sima. She is a senior research fellow at the Institute of National Security Studies with a very rich career at the Israeli intelligence community before her retirement. Her last position was head of the Research and Evaluation Division of the Mossad. In the Institute, she holds the Iran file, and I assume that she will focus on the relationship between Russia and Iran. And the last one will be Professor Dmitry, or Dima as we call him, which is much easier, Adamsky, which is head of the BA honors track in strategy and decision-making in the IDC, which is, I think, the most prestigious privately owned academic institute in Israel. But before becoming a scholar, and I can say that based on my impression of him, a very original scholar, he also gained some experience in the Israeli defense community. So we'll start with Elena, please.
Thank you. Good morning, everybody. Reading the title of this conference, The Russia in the Middle East, I remembered suddenly the piece of art of a Russian-French artist of Belarusian Jewish origin, Marc Chagall. To Russia, donkeys and others. In French, à la Russie, aux uns et aux autres, from 1912. Maybe because I saw it recently in Louvre, Abu Dhabi, which celebrated now 2 years anniversary. Maybe because of its extremely magical colors and the contrast between the real and the unreal. There is a contradiction between the conservative by its nature country and its cosmic environment. This country is not simply existing, but flying forward with its fair principles and with some success in the world where the rules and logic and the rules of logic and normality don't exist anymore, the Middle East. I also was impressed to see how at this small exhibition in Abu Dhabi, Arab students were looking to other work of Marc Chagall, Jewish rabbis, with a great interest and no any signs of hatred. On the contrary, with a readiness to a dialogue and mutual understanding. Still, there are some islands of stability in this region, and we need Israel to be this island of stability. But speaking broadly and frequently, we can assume that the troubles will continue in this region for some time of come. Old conflicts are existing, and like Israel-Palestinian conflict, and it needs to be solved, in our opinion. And new conflicts will arise. Borders problems are also very alarming. The scale of events is similar to what happened during the first half of the 20th century when this work of Marc Chagall was created. The world, and especially the Middle East, is going through an unprecedented period of transition. The economic situation is going worse, it's no doubt on it. By the way, Russian tourists, still very important source of income for many countries. There were more than 6 million Russian tourists in Turkey in last year, and more than 380,000 in Israel same year. Could be more, maybe. We need more attention and more relief for Russian tourists to pass borders, of course. Take care of Russian tourists. And don't forget that Egypt, Morocco, Tunisia, Gulf countries, even Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and Sultanate Oman are counting on Russian tourists as well. According to World Bank, Middle East and North Africa needs 300 million jobs by 2050. It means that each year about 20 Arab countries need to create 10 million jobs every year. Is it possible? I have doubted it. You too, it seems, yes. Add to this demographic growth and new technologies, killing some new opportunities. Egypt now is more than 100 million people, and at 2030 it will be about 120 million. The same many Arab, African, and Asian countries. The fundamental causes of unrest in the Middle East mainly have their roots in social problems. Many of them remain unsolved. Simply to take in from rich and to give to other rich, it's not the solution. It's even not a temporal measure. And there are other threats like very dangerous tensions between Iran on one side and the US and its regional allies on the other. It poses significant risks to the global economy and security, especially with all this history of the distrust in this region. Russia today is ready to help in de-escalation these tensions. And the Russian position is unique. Russia is maneuvering, and unlike the US, we have very good relationship with all main powers in the region. And believe me, it's not so easy. And in my opinion, this is a sign of very high professionalism from our diplomats and from our presidential administration. From my point of view, mutual guarantees are needed in this region. Additionally, it must not be any regime change by external forces in the Middle East and North Africa and not anywhere. The examples of Iraq and Libya prove how dangerous is this approach. Nobody knows even who should be accountable when such interventions fail, and as it happened in Iraq and Libya. The question now, will be a single country able to cope with all these challenges by itself? Of course not. However, we need to recognize that disputes about particulars often overshadow serious problems, and it requires determination and understanding. No stability islands will shelter from in this rich sea of changements. We need rules to be defined, and we need more of mutual understanding. Chess doesn't work if there are no rules, and if your opponent is unpredictable and could hit you over the head with the board. It's not possible to play the game with such absence of the rules. The principles of state sovereignty and no intervention in countries' internal affairs are very important. We're not anymore outsiders or observers here in the Middle East. Its problems are our problems. In today's interconnected world, it's impossible to contain a problem in one location. The events in Syria, for example, led to many terror attacks in Europe. Remember 13 November 2015 in Paris, or 22nd March 2016 in Brussels, some attacks in Germany and England. There is a common threat. During the liberation of Aleppo from extremists in December 2016, Russian radio monitoring systems intercepted the talks between militants in more than 9 languages. In English, in Arabic, Russian, French, Spanish, and other Chinese even, and other languages. No any doubt that Russian involvement in Syria at the end of September 2015 has radically changed the war's outcome. But it's not about how to make an egg from the omelette. Believe me, our militaries have enough egg to go forwards. But it's about to stabilize the situation and about how to eliminate organizations and groups linked to Islamic States and Al-Qaeda, like Jabhat al-Nusra, and how to create jobs for Syrians and to help refugees to return to their homes. I have been recently, in September, in Syria, visiting our 2 military bases in Tartus and Hmeimim. I also visited Damascus, Tadmor, Palmyra, and the south of Idlib, the city Khan Sheikhoun. And people there were asking me not about high policies, but about new houses, about new jobs, new opportunities, and about potential donors to reconstruct even historical museum in Palmyra, and it's still destroyed, and to reconstruct Temple of Baal and Great Colonnade. Russia and Europe and and even US, whose role in the region now is in flux, can find common ground about to do this together. Other potential donors, where is Iran, Lerman? Yeah, other potential donors might include Gulf states and China. Not only China or Gulf states, but together, China, Europe, US, Gulf states. Russia would like Syria to be stabilized as well as all the region. Its big challenge, not for one country. There are many of black holes and great zones where the chaos will continue, but Russia proved, in my opinion, that it's predictable and reasonable and professional player. Finally, anyway, after each night, and you know this, in the Middle East, after each night, the dawn is coming. Thank you.
Okay, hello. First, let me thank you, the organizers, and the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung for inviting me. It's a privilege to be here. It's not very often that when there is a discussion of a bilateral relationship that outsiders are asked to comment and to give their opinions. So I would like to repeat what Erwin said in the first panel, that I feel a bit humble here, and I'll offer a number of ideas which of course reflect my own perspective and my own methodology, which is that I'm trying to looking at Russian foreign policy. I'm trying to look at it from trying to look at it in a neutral way, in the sense that I'm trying not to put in my own values and my own assessments, and I'm trying to use a kind of anthropological method in which I'm trying to kind of embrace the point of view and try to analyze it, taking the assumptions and reconstructing the assumptions of those who conduct and guide it. And from there are a number of points on which I'm in agreement with the previous speakers. I'm not going to repeat them, but I think the devil is very often in the details. So my take on some of them would be somewhat different. Okay, and I think it's a couple of key ideas or concepts that I think should guide our thinking about Russian policies in the Middle East. First is, I think it's, and I like the comment about not using the term Middle East. Because when you look at when I reconstruct the way that Russian policymakers and analysts look at the Middle East, I see two different zones. I see the first zone, which is composed of Turkey and Iran. And these countries are treated by the Russian political establishment as serious players, potential partners. Also for the reason that these countries are close to either Russian border or to what the Russian elite considers its zone of interest. So Turkey is across the Black Sea. It's a neighbor in Transcaucasia. Iran is a neighbor across the Caspian Sea, and also a border on Central Asia and Transcaucasia. And the second belt, as it were, that's what we would call I would call it, for lack of a better word, this implication, an Arab world. This is the second zone. And I think Israel plays a special role. It's neither here nor there, I think. So one has to remember that when one thinks about Russian policy. So I think the Russian policies towards the first of those zones are very much driven by the concerns that have to do with so-called close abroad, with the question of neighborhood. And these are neighbors. You have to think of them as neighbors. You have to live with them as neighbors. You have to make sure that they are on the right side of the game. And this is absolute priority, I think, or relative priority. The second zone is, from the point of view of the Russian strategic vision, is less important. I would say it's treated much more instrumentally than the first one. So instrumental approach, I think it's a key word if you think about the Middle East, south of Iran and Turkey. Then you have to take into account the overall scheme or overall vision, say vision thing, of Russian policy. It's not a vision, it's a kind of a set of assumptions about the world and set of assumptions about interests. There is this famous saying by Churchill, who said, Russia is a mystery wrapped up in an enigma. And usually the first part gets quoted and the second part is not quoted. And then he said, if you want to understand, you have to go back. It's not a direct quote, but it's you have to go back to the category of national interest. So, and he was talking about the Soviet Union, by the way. So national interest. And I would say, yes, I would agree with that, but I would put regime interest or political establishment interest and not national interest. I think in the Russian case, this is extremely important distinction. And I think if you look at the foreign policy of the current political establishment, you have to think about two things. First of all, there was some talk here about what's the chronological point of departure, chronological reference point. 2014 was quoted, some other dates were quoted. I think if you look carefully and you listen carefully to the internal discourse of the let's say ruling group, this is definitely 1990, 1991, the collapse of the Soviet Union. This is the reference point. This is the reference point. And by the way, a lot of points about that were Mr. Lerman was talking about this what motivates foreign policy, talking about anger and fear. And this connects exactly with this 1991, the collapse of the Soviet Union issue, and Putin was talking about it several times. I think it's absolutely crucial because for the generation that now rules Russia and makes the decision, and I agree here that decision making on foreign policy in Russia is extremely centralized. But I don't quite buy that Putin is kind of the autocrat. I think there is an element of collective leadership there, and it's not a coincidence that before every major political, not every, because we don't, but very often when we know that there is some important political decision to be made, Security Council meets. Security Council meets, and its composition is very interesting as well. So I think this is where decisions are taken. And I think the guiding light, the guiding idea is for foreign policy. Foreign policy, first of all, has to contribute to regime legitimacy in two ways. First is that, and that also was articulated here in the previous panel, for the Russian elite, but also I see for the population as a whole, although that's more debatable, the idea or the feeling that you are a great power or rule setter is a part of national idea. This is, I think Putin said at one point a couple of times, either we are going to be a great power or we are going to disappear as a state. So it's either or. It's also very, I think, very typical of this political culture and this foreign policy culture, this either or, this dichotomy that's built into the software, as it were, of this political group. Second, they think about regime security, and that's part of their heritage as, and I think there is a continuity here. There's a direct personal continuity. Also in terms of structures, in terms of what they read, what they talked about. They are heirs to the tradition of being a great power, the Soviet, even a superpower. Now, they know they are not going to be a superpower like the Soviet Union, but they still would like to be, again, and they think this is vitally important for the survival of the regime to be a great power, because only a great power, only the rule setter can set the rules in such a way that there is no external challenge to the legitimacy of the regime, which for this particular regime, I think it's a crucial thing. So, and again, what kind of external milieu this regime sees as meeting its criteria for secure world order or international order. And then we go again to this issue between, again, which was raised in the first panel about national idea and the idea of international order. I think there's direct connection between the way that these people think about internal politics and the kind of the system that they have internally, and they project the same kind of a system. They would like to have the same kind of system on the international level. That's, let's say, oligarchic system. A group of powerful players set the terms and keep things in control. The same is on the international level. The idea of having this plural, kind of multipolar, as the word was coined or borrowed actually from the American international relations theorists, theoreticians in mid-early 90s. So this multipolarity is the game. And of course, the threat to multipolarity has come from the United States. I think this is a discourse that's still there, but I think things are changing very fast today, and I think we're not really catching up, because I think what I detect, maybe I'm wrong, but this is what I hear and this is what I understand. During the last couple of years, there has been, to my ear, to my eyes, a very dramatic change in Moscow in terms of how they see the global picture. I think they no longer believe that multipolarity is a practical possibility. It just doesn't work. It's not there. I think, and Putin actually said that in various contexts a couple of times, the new axis, this new system is going to be defined by US-Chinese confrontation, axis, rivalry, whatever you call it. And then what's the role of Russia in that? Well, definitely on the side of Americans. That's absolutely excluded for reasons that have to do with, again, with internal security of the regime. The Chinese are problematic. There are problems with them. But so far, they're lesser evil. They're a lesser evil than American or Western multilateral or whatever unilateral arrangement. So I think a lot of things. This is the framework. This is the mental framework within which decisions are being made now. Now, when we come to the Middle East, I think when this started, when this engagement in 2015 started, it was again purely instrumental. It was driven by two things. One was that one had to, well, first of all, opportunity. This is a wonderful opportunity to show that we are a great power. And Russian press and TV waxed on the idea that now we returned back to the place where the Soviet Union used to be a big and influential power, although not in the same sense, not in the same way, but still, we are a player. We are an important global player. This is important. Second, I think there was a tendency, or there was the desire to stop. It might sound crazy, but I think this is. I can give you some quotes on that. That there was a domino logic involved. Syria, after the fall of Syria, the Americans are going to try a similar policy towards Iran, and then Moscow is at the end of this road. So we have to put you have to draw a red line. And also, another precedent of regime change policy of the West is not going to stand. We are strong enough now to deny them that. And I think this is what really was behind this. And I think there was no long-term planning. I agree. And now we come to the situation that is, and the idea that I think was behind a lot of Russian diplomatic moves around this issue, and it sort of fits very well with this idea of great power, because this great power concert that was supposed to be constructed on the global level was also supposed to take place on the regional level. So the idea of having a trilateral Iranian, Turkish, Russian kind of directorate for Syria at least, if not for Syria, Iraq, and so on, I think was somewhere there behind the behind the Russian policy. Now this brings us to a couple of important conclusions or sort of observations, not conclusions. One is that we all have our own wishful thinking and our own biases coming from where we come from, or what we want, what we fear, and so on and so on. I think it's striking that I've been watching this since 2015, so not for a very long time, but it seems to me that the idea that Russia is going to come to a decision in which it's going to decisively try to limit Iranian influence in Syria, I think that's unrealistic. It's completely divorced from the way that people in Moscow, or leadership in Moscow, thinks about such things. There's no way that Russia is going to confront Iran. And if you read carefully what Lavrov is saying actually openly, when he's saying, I remember there was this question asked exactly about this thing, and he was saying, look, Iran is a great power, regional great power. It has a right to its interests, and so on and so on. So you have to respect the interests of Iran. I think there is understanding, because part of the definition of what great power is, it is entitled to its close abroad. It's entitled to its spheres of interest. The Iranian sphere of interest has to be south. It cannot be north. I think the Russian political class remembers quite well and appreciates the fact that Iran has not tried to take the opportunity after the collapse of the Soviet Union, extend its influence to the north. And I think they have an interest in encouraging southern projection of power of Iran. Plus, of course, that was also referred to by Mr. Antonenko, I agree, they cannot really get rid of Assad for symbolic and other reasons. They cannot think, and they have no way of pushing, of engineering the situation, the influence the situation on the ground in Syria to create a stable regime. The stable regime has to find a way to work in the Sunni majority. They've been trying to do that, but it somehow does not work. There's no Sunni power that can do it, like Turkey can do it for the fringe, for the north, and Iran can do for some pro-Iranian elements. So it's just it doesn't work. It falls apart. So we are in a bind. Okay, I think I'll finish with this. Good work. Thanks.
Thank you. Sima, please.
Okay, thank you. I'll try to concentrate more on Iran and take some of the things that you have mentioned and others in order to present some ideas. First of all, I want to start by saying a general remark about Russia in the Middle East. I have to admit that I started my career in the intelligence when I was very young as an expert on the Soviet Union, and I speak Russian, not very well, but from family origin. So the issue of the perspective of Russia and Soviet Union in the Middle East, I always have in mind, even though I'm not, I'm researching the Iran and the Middle East and not Russia anymore for many, many years. So first of all, I want to say that I don't think there is a major change in the interest of Russia if I try to find, to look to the past from the Soviet Union point of view. There are, I would say, four major interests in the Middle East, generally speaking, not specifically with Iran and Turkey and others. One is, it is on the borders, you mentioned it, neighbors. The Middle East, in its broad geographical term, is on the southern borders of Russia, and for that, it's important. Then there is the oil and OPEC and the issue of the prices of oil, which is a major, major issue, especially in the last decade with Putin, and rightly so. Then those are the countries that are buying arms from Russia and from the Soviet Union for many, many years. And also in the last decades, also nuclear reactors, as we see it in Egypt, in Turkey, and other places. So it is an economic, very pure and rightfully so, an economic interest. And the other one, and I don't put any priorities, the other one is the cards vis-a-vis the West. And as you mentioned correctly, I think it depends on the leadership in each period to put the priorities between those interests. What is more important? Is it cards vis-a-vis the West, or is it our southern borders, or others? I liked very much, Oksana, your presentation. But there is one thing I tend to differ with you, and that is, I think the success of Russia to have good relations with both sides is something that should be appreciated. I don't think it is all because Russian diplomacy was so excellent. I think it's much more because the absence of the US and the disappointment of players in the Middle East from the US policy. But this is an achievement that should be appreciated. The fact that Putin can meet with Rouhani, in brackets, more time than he met with Bibi Netanyahu, does not interfere in his ability to go to Saudi Arabia and to meet with the Saudis. And I think from Russian point of view, it's an achievement, because they, of course, they don't have the close relations with Saudi Arabia as they have with Iran, but the fact that they have open channels and they can talk, and on the oil issue, they can combine policies, this is a huge achievement. And of course, when you look on Israel, you see they are talking to the Syrians, with the Iranians, with Israel. This is, from the political point of view, from diplomatic point of view, it's an important achievement. Now, I want mainly, since I'm dealing in the institute with Iran, and since I think Iran is a major player in the Middle East in the last decades, I want to concentrate on Russia-Iran and say some words about that. And I actually will be a spoiler. I'll say at the beginning exactly the conclusion that I have at the end. And my conclusion is, I have to say it black and white because there is no time, so of course there are nuances. There are more common interests between Russia and Iran than there are diversities. And I think all the hopeful dreams of Israelis, Americans, and others to draw a wedge between Russia and Iran are dreams, and your policy cannot be based on dreams. It is correct that there are a lot of problems they see differently. Bashar Assad, I think they say differently. The influence of Iran in Syria, economic issues. No question about that. But generally speaking, when we look on those relations, even between Israel and the US, there are periods of time where we are strategic partners, there are problems. So I think generally speaking, and the question always, is it a strategic relationship or is it just a marriage of convenience? I think it's a strategic relationship. Now, I'll take the case of Syria, because I think this is an example, is a very current one, and a good example to show how those two countries have come to a cooperation that we didn't see before, neither on the side of the Russians nor on the side of the Iranians. It's the first time, I can say from the Iranian point of view, it's the first time that Iran has sent soldiers abroad, not on its borders. It's the first time that it is cooperating with a superpower, and if some of you remember the issue of Russian airplanes landing in Iran, which was a major issue in the Majlis, in the Iranian parliament, and didn't happen again. But this is just a small symbol of how those two countries decided to cooperate in order to save Bashar Assad. It's not Bashar Assad the man, it's Bashar Assad the regime. And the fact that the Russians perhaps might see another Bashar Assad, someone else, doesn't matter at the end of the day. Both sides want to see the same regime in Damascus. And both sides want to see a situation where no one from the outside or from the inside can change the regime. People on the streets would not change the regime. Americans supporting people on the, as they say, will not change the regime. And that was very important for the Iranians. We just saw it now in the streets of Tehran, Mashhad, Tabriz, everywhere across Iran. And the same is in Russia. So I think when we are talking on those two countries, these interests are very important. Then there is a very important another interest, and that is to minimize the influence of the US in the Middle East. Neither Iran nor Russia want to see American presence in the Middle East and American influence in the Middle East. So this is a strategic common interest, and everyone translates it in a different place, in a different way. Both countries are under sanctions, American sanctions. There is, of course, a common interest to show that sanctions are not a diplomatic tool that will bring the U.S. The achievement that it hopes to have. So, by just mentioning part of that, there are probably some others. I think that we can assume that this relationship will continue for a long time. There will be differences, there will be problems here and there, but the basis of the interest, of the national interest of both sides and the interest for the future, I don't see a major change in them. I want to add to that also, of course, the nuclear issue. One cannot talk about Iran, Russia without the nuclear issue. And I want to say here several things. One, Russia was part of the sanctions on Iran, of the Security Council resolutions in 2010 and before, putting sanctions on Iran. It wasn't easy to bring Russia to support those sanctions, but I think the option, the other option, that if sanctions are not there and if Iran continues with its nuclear program, and if someone attacks Iran and there is a major war in the Middle East, was more threatening than cooperating with the West on sanctions. And of course, Russia always knew how to exempt the interest of Russia in Bushehr and in other places in order to, even under sanctions, to be able to continue its cooperation with Iran. So that was in the previous time until the nuclear agreement, and I think from that point of view that Russia was quite constructive in the period of the negotiations between the P5+1 and Iran. Constructive from the point of view that it was a good friend of the Iranians that was putting pressure on Iran to cooperate on this and other issues, not on all issues, of course, and not without its own interest, but still it was an important development. Well, the picture today is on the opposite. Russia is on the side of those that are against the withdrawal. Not only Russia, of course, against the withdrawal of President Trump and his administration from the agreement. Is trying to do everything it can in order to benefit from that. To have more economic cooperation, more nuclear cooperation, Bushehr 2 and 3, and arms sales, and of course believes that Iran could be, and this is also an important point that should be mentioned. People are talking Iran is a card in the hands of Russia vis-à-vis the US. It is a small card, but it is not a card that Iran will be sold totally, and Russia will change camps in order to have a better relations in the US. And in any case, there is no reason to believe that relations with the US will be better as long as Trump has his problems inside in the US, and as long as the Ukraine issue is not solved. So I don't think this talking that we see so much in the press is relevant for the near future. So when we look on all the places where Iran is involved, which is Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Gaza, in most of the places, even though Russia has very good relations with Israel and understands Israel concerns, and I think on many issues they really understand that we have our concerns and they are legitimate. When we are concerned from Iranian establishing their forces on the border of Syria and Israel, I think the Russians understand it. Are they able to do something? No. Are they able to follow each soldier if he's dressed, if he speaks with a Russian accent or not? Is he cooperating with Hezbollah or not? I don't think they want to do it. I don't think they can do it. And therefore, the belief from the beginning that Russia can deliver Iran in Syria was based on a mistake, and a very huge mistake from Israel's point of view. At the same time, I think Russia is playing quite interesting in Syria. On one hand, I wouldn't say allowing Israel to attack, but accepting the attacks that Israel is doing in Syria. On the other hand, from time to time, cooperating with I would say, closing eye on what Iran is doing in Syria, and I would dare to say also supporting with intelligence the Iranian interest vis-à-vis Israel in several cases. So the reason for that is, of course, because they need the Iranians need the Russians. Syria is not solved. I think the dream, there are some dreams when we are talking on this issue. The dream that Russia has that the West will economically support Syria is a dream that will not be, as you mentioned correctly, will not be materialized in the near future, 5-10 years. No one, neither in Europe nor in the US, wants to put $1 on €1 on Bashar Assad, the killer of hundreds of thousands of his own people. So this is a dream that should be understood, and it's a slogan that should be stopped. And I don't think Bashar Assad wants to reconstruct Syria. He doesn't want to see all the refugees coming back to Syria, and he thinks that it is a threat to his own regime, and therefore he is not going to ask for any money, and of course not do any compromise in order to get any money. So we should understand this situation. From Bashar Assad's point of view, the fact that those people left Syria is a blessing. It's a blessing because they were against the regime, and he doesn't need them anymore. So we have to understand that on many issues, and of course the Iranians do have an interest because they are supporting him. The militias that they brought from abroad, which is a new phenomenon from the Iranian point of view also, will stay in Syria. They will be part of the army, part of the militia, a separate militia, something, but they will promote the interest of Iran, as we see now in Iraq. Who is promoting the interest of Iran in Iraq vis-à-vis the demonstrations on the street? It's the pro-Iranian militia in Iraq. So this is the pattern. Who is promoting the interest of Iran in Lebanon? Hezbollah. So this is the pattern that Iran wants to have in Syria. This is because they understand that the Russians need them in Syria, they are using the situation. The Russians don't have the tools to stop it, and they are doing their best in order to have their own influence, but it is doubtful if they are able to have it like the Iranians. So we are, and I am finishing here, we are in a quagmire in Syria. I think the situation, not Israel, Russia, Iran, Turkey, Bashar Assad, all are in the same quagmire, and there is a big question mark if one of them can get out and have his own interest fulfilled. Thank you.
Thank you, Sima. Dima, please.
We didn't coordinate.
No.
It's an interesting. First time I'm here.
Okay, good afternoon, and it's very good to be here, so thank you for the opportunity, the organizers, Ambassador Tzvi again, Dr. Vera Michelin, and of course Generals Udi Dekel and General Shlomo Brom. It's really an academic honor and professional privilege to address the audience. What I will try to do in the next 15 minutes that I have is basically to share with you the findings from my recent research that deals with the issue of religion, politics, and strategy in Russia. And specifically, I'd like to talk about the role of the Russian Orthodox Church in Moscow's Syrian campaign. Let me do it in 3 steps. I'll very briefly take you through the general context, which is the state-church relations in Russia. Then I will try to highlight 3 main ecclesiastical contributions of the Russian Orthodox Church to Russian foreign policy in the region, and finally I will outline the way ahead. If we look today at the role that religion and faith are playing in Russian national identity, ideology, and politics, we are probably looking at the climate since their Soviet collapse. We're basically looking at the nexus between their faith, church, and policy since the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. When we're looking at the bureaucratic landscape and its Russian policy, domestic and international, I would argue that national security policy and strategic community, these are places where this impact or nexus is most visible. The topic of faith and strategy nexus in Russia largely has been outside the scope of academic research here in Israel or elsewhere in the West. Scholars who are exploring state-church relations in Russia, they do pay attention to foreign policy. However, specifically the Middle Eastern issue is usually, and specifically the Russian operation in Syria, is usually outside the scope of their analysis. What I'm trying to do in my recent publication, in my recent book, and also in my recent articles, and what I'm trying to offer you right now is basically to fulfill this void. What is my main argument? My main argument is that the current Russian diplomatic military enterprise in Syria, in the Middle East, has been most significantly touched by faith and religion. We can, of course, debate and discuss the extent of ecclesiastical contribution and the actual effectiveness of ecclesiastical contribution, but this campaign in Syria, is the most telling illustration of nexus of religion and strategy in Russia today. It's not the first time that Russian Orthodox Church is contributing to the Russian foreign policy enterprises, but I think given their intensity, the scope, and the duration of the Russian involvement in Syrian campaign, we are looking at their case of unprecedented ecclesiastical presence. So I think that's what comes to the general context. What are we actually looking at? I would argue that if we broadly summarize or examine the campaign that started roughly about 4 years ago, in September, October 1915, we're looking at 3.
2015.
What did I say?
19.
Oh, it probably reflects my wishful thinking. Yes, so yes, we're looking at 4 years, starting from September 2015 till today, and in this period of time, we're looking at 3 main deliverables, ecclesiastical deliverables, if you wish, that the Russian Orthodox Church provided the Kremlin with. The first one, let me take you through the 3 of those. The first one is a messianic raison d'etre, if you wish, a messianic mission that Russian Orthodox Church provided to the leaders, the Russian leaders contemplating the campaign. And I definitely accept observation of Dr. Rodkiewicz. It's more than just a leader, it's just the Russian political elite. And the Russian Orthodox Church is providing the political elite with this sort of messianic raison d'etre. Now, historically, if we go back to Russian history, Russian Orthodox Church provided Russian rulers during their pre-Soviet times with messianic interpretations. We can even argue, or some people would argue, that even during the Soviet times, what we call ideational or ideological interpretations were also an extension of the same trend. So historically, we do observe examples of messianic ideas underlying foreign policy. Now, the tide of religious metaphysics in Russian history had ups and downs through history, but it had also the varying impact on policy. But it was always there. There was always a synthesis between the two. Pretty much, by the way, like in many other countries around the world. I would argue that ecclesiastical geopolitics peaked again under the current president and also especially under the current patriarch when political myths or ideational notions or ideas of Holy Rus, the Third Rome, and Russia's civilizational role as an extension of these two first ideas became applied notions which are informing political and public debates and discourse in Russia. Actually, this time again, during this operation, basically from the beginning of the regional turmoil, even before the Russian involvement in Syria, the Russian Orthodox Church introduced the problem of persecuted Christians to the Kremlin, and it also influenced the ways that Russian establishment framed this problem and framed its own role in Syria. The Russian Orthodox Church framed intervention in conceptual spiritual terms and presented the Russian role in the region as some sort of realization of Russian civilizational role in the world. The Third Rome, that is defending or patronizing persecuted Christians in the Middle East. Not only Orthodox Christians, but Christians in general, as their mission of their Third Rome, of the Holy Rus, of the Orthodoxy demands. This framing, in addition to providing some sort of, if you wish, instrumental pretext for diplomatic military initiatives of the Kremlin, also enabled the leaders to operate from the position of moral psychological comfort, something that is quite often disregarded by Western commentators. So I think that's the first main deliverable. The second deliverable, the second ecclesiastical contribution, is a legitimization of the Kremlin's policy at home and abroad. Again, since the beginning of the regional turmoil, we see ecclesiastical diplomacy, if you wish, public diplomacy, waged by senior Russian clerics who are engaging foreign leaders, diplomats, politicians, international organizations, senior clerics in the Orthodox world, but also in Christian denominations beyond Orthodoxy, be it Catholic world or evangelical Protestant communities in Europe or in the United States, and of course also Muslim audiences to legitimize the Kremlin's enterprises in Syria. The Russian Orthodox Church, if we are following the discourse, promoted 3 very straightforward and very interrelated messages. That Russian operation actually epitomizes their fight of the forces of light against the forces of evil. And for this reason, this operation is not only morally justifiable and legitimate, but also strategically desirable. And that the United States and Russian Federation should actually join forces in fighting against terrorism and putting their disagreements aside. In theory, the establishment of this counterterrorism cooperation with the United States the idea was to extend the momentum and to project this cooperative climate to other bonds of contention between two powers, and which was also one of the main Kremlin's desires, or desires of the Russian diplomacy back then and even today. By the way, the similarity, or if you wish, the correspondence of this plea of the Russian Orthodox Church, the correspondence of this plea with the main messages of the Russian diplomacy is not accidental, but actually mutually reinforcing. And finally, to the third deliverable. I think that Russian Orthodox Church enabled Russian political elite and the Kremlin to sustain a necessary level of domestic support to the operation. I think it was mentioned here today, and it was definitely mentioned in this room in the previous years, and it was also mentioned around the world. The current operation in Syria is one of the most risky or challenging or demanding enterprises that the post-Soviet leadership initiated. Domestically, this intervention evoked very traumatic memories or resonance with associations of costly and futile military enterprises in Afghanistan or in Chechnya, but it appeared even more questionable in this particular setting given their distance from Russian borders. This is one of their historically farthest power projections of Russia. And also, this is also a challenging enterprise in light of their very specific historical moment when it took place. I remind you, 2015, it's exactly the time when sanctions and counter-sanctions hit Russian economics, and it's also the time when the level of inflation in Russia is hitting their climate from their post-Soviet times. So this is tremendously challenging economic period. The combination of these two, traumatic memories of their public memory and the challenging economic situation, are turning this operation into something very problematic as far as the Russian public is concerned. Now, the Russian Orthodox Church, by the beginning of the operation, definitely established itself in Russian politics as an actor capable of influencing public discourse, and for this very reason, it focused on neutralizing these concerns within the Russian public. Presumably, also, the Russian Orthodox Church felt more comfortable to do it in the Syrian context rather than in the Ukrainian context, since the Syrian issue was less controversial than the Syrian one. There were three interrelated notions, if we are following Russian discourse, that enabled the Moscow Patriarchy to legitimize this campaign in the eyes of the local population. First of all, as I already mentioned, Russia, in involving its military forces in Syria, is acting as a traditional protector of persecuted Christians in the region. Number two, it's the centrality of the Syrian Christian community to Orthodox believers, because if you think about it, Syria is actually one of the cradles of Christianity, especially the place where the first churches were established. And finally, moving more to the geopolitical dimensions of the messages, Russia is actually materializing its great power status while being in Syria, in counterbalance of American unilateralism and, if you wish, even hypocrisy. Just think about the message. The country that is signing on its $1 banknote, "In God we trust," is not doing anything particular for the persecuted Christians of the Middle East. And we in Russia, we in Moscow, are doing this exactly thing, which is another way materializing the role of Catechon, their power that is preserving the international balance between, or global balance between forces of light and forces of evil. Well, if this sounds to you something very hyperbolic or allegorical, we can also go to the Russian military, and that's the second contribution in the domestic arena. During the campaign, the Russian Orthodox Church, but especially the Russian military clergy, which is the part and parcel of the Russian armed forces since 2019, and which is today part of the main military political directorate of the Ministry of Defense, the reincarnation of the main political directorate from the Soviet times, actually contributed to the Russian war effort in Syria. Today, in addition to performing in all the branches of the Russian military, since the beginning of the operation, Russian military priests and also Russian civilian priests has been regularly rotated to Syria together with the forces. By the way, military priests were also part of the first wave of forces that arrived into Syria in August, September, October 2015. There are two churches functioning in Syria, military churches, one in Khmeimim and one in Latakia, two military temples. And these churches and these clerics are providing uninterrupted pastoral, patriotic care or support to the units all over Syria. What Russian commanders did, they basically translated the narrative that the Russian Orthodox Church was announcing about the moral obligation of the Russian servicemen to the sense of mission and to the higher level of motivations of the Russian soldiers serving in Syria, and of course also to the higher level of discipline. The military brass, if you're going to Russian military commanders and you're reading what Russian military commanders are saying about the contribution of the church, you will hear that pastoral activities within the expeditionary force in Syria enhance unit cohesion and overall combat effectiveness on the battlefield, on the theater, on the Syrian theater of operation. Well, let me conclude with just summarizing the main point. The contribution of their phase strategy nexus in Syria to Moscow's performance in the Middle East is mainly about the exploration of the social, instrumental function of religion, not necessarily theological aspect of religion, and it's some sort of a mixture of, if you wish, elite instrumentalism, political alliances of convenience, but also an earnestly held belief. Pretty much, by the way, like in many countries around the world, including in this very region. Since religiosity in Russia overall, given the sociological and anthropological data, appears to be less a practiced faith, but more secular ideational construct instilled by the state, the Russian strategic community is exploiting in a very skillful manner this organizational rather than theological utility of religion. Now, I don't want to overblow their role of the Russian Orthodox Church and of the Russian Orthodox faith in Russian national security policy, and I think that many of the self-contributing statements by Russian clerical and senior officials should be taken with a grain of salt. We actually don't know enough what is the actual impact of these messages and discourse on Russian domestic audiences, on the level of motivation of the soldiers, or on foreign leaders on international arena. However, it is as important as not to overblow the importance of religion in the Russian policy. It is also important equally not to underestimate the role that religion and faith is playing in Russian national security today. I would argue that three deliverables that Syrian case illustrated to us, the sense of mission, legitimization of the operation on the domestic and international arenas, and finally a combat effectiveness, are not going to be unique to the Syrian case. I would argue that they are going to be part and parcel of the Russian national security approach. And we might expect to observe this type of conduct also in other foreign policy moves of Russia, be it in the Middle East, in Syria, or beyond. Thank you again. I'll stop here.
Thank you, Dima. We have still some time. So, my first question is to Elena and Witold, because I want to combine what the two of you said. Elena, you say that the first interest of Russia in the Middle East is stability, stabilization, because instability and problems can have repercussions on Russia in our connected world. But the question is, how do you achieve stability? And one answer to it is by keeping the status quo, But when you look at what Russia is doing, it's not really what it is doing. It's not really what it is doing. In Syria, it supported the government in power, which is keeping the status quo. But in Libya, for example, it supports General Haftar, which rebelled against the government in Tripoli. So one gets the impression that the Russian concept of stability is authoritarian regimes, the rule of strongmen. Is it right? Is it true? And Witold, you actually said that Russia, also in the global arena, likes to see government and regimes that are similar in their conduct to the Russian government. Is the interpretation of this wish of Russia in the Middle East, once again, the authoritarian rules, rule of strongmen? Sima, you elaborated on the ability of Russia to speak with everyone. But speaking with everyone is not a goal in itself. You speak with everyone to achieve something. Is Russia having real achievements because of that? On the long run. And is this policy sustainable? Let's assume, for example, that the conflict between Israel and Iran will, in Syria and elsewhere, will escalate. Russia will be able to keep its policy, or will it have to take side? And Dima, you presented a very interesting thesis, but I have a question. Is it serious? Is it a real issue that the Orthodox church that influences the policies of Russia in the Middle East or elsewhere? Or is it cynical manipulation, or what you called instrumental? What is more? Thank you. Please.
Thank you. First of all, I want to comment on the last speech of Dmitry, because I prayed in both churches. It's in Tartus and Khmeimim, and it's not military churches, it's churches. You remembered me the quatrain of Igor Guberman. I will try to translate it to English, but I will say in Russian also. If Russia will have, if my angel country will have two clean angel wings, and etc. Моей бы ангельской державушки два чистых ангельских крыла. I can continue because it's not so polite later. But to speak about religion, especially in this region, it's a very big challenge in my opinion, especially Russia. It's a multi-religion and multinational country. I remember, maybe some of them remember the speech of Putin in Ufa in Bashkiria in October of 2013. He mentioned that Russia must be far away of all inter-religion conflicts and must create its internal school of Islam, or recreate, and must be far away of all external influences like Wahhabism and etc. Yes, most of Russians are Christians, but there are about 15 millions or 20 millions, the numbers are different, of Muslims. There are Other religions, and if you will see to Russian policy, Russian military policy in Syria, you will find that most of them are Muslims, and they do very well. Why? Because they know local traditions, and some of them speak Arabic, and it helps them to solve some even local conflicts. And the mosque in Aleppo is under reconstruction now with the help of Ramzan Kadyrov, the leader of Chechnya. Political power, yes, is related to your beliefs, but it grows out of the barrel of the gun, as Mao mentioned once, but we can repeat the same, because here in Israel, I think you know this very well, you must be strong. Not because there is something related to ex-Soviet Union or something like this. Many of the speakers mentioned that Russia is trying to be strong. Yes, we're trying to be strong. Putin will come maybe to Israel next year on 27th of January. It is the day of, before the day of Holocaust, anyway, yeah?
The International Day.
The International Day of Holocaust. Why it is in January, in this day exactly? Because Russian army entered Soviet army in Poland and liberated people there. So we have very good memory. And one of motto from this time is, if only there was no war. We repeat it oftenly. Yes, we don't want to repeat it. And sometimes this motto was driving us in our Middle Eastern policy. There is a recent book of Alexei Vasilyev, Professor Alexei Vasilyev, named From Lenin to Putin, Russia in the Middle East. So he is writing exactly there about this, that Russia is thinking about if only there was no war once again. And you need to be strong. And I agree very much to Oksana that we need to be strong, not from military point of view, but also from technological, etc. And we're working hard on this. Answer to your question, General Brom, in Libya, we have a very good relationship with the government of Sarraj. We're not only counting on Haftar, and even we have a good relationship with the third part, like Misurata. And Russia is playing with all main powers in Libya, trying to bring them together. And about stability, I think you answered this question once yourself. When you wrote an article with others about Russian policy in the Middle East, if I am not wrong, but you said that Israel and America sometimes don't trust Russia, but only Putin can prevent the war with Iran. Yeah? Thank you.
Yeah, I think it's a complicated question, in fact. In spite of, in fact, it's a complicated answer to a question. I think, yes, the bottom line is, in societies like Middle Eastern ones, the guys who are authoritarian provide stability, yes. But this is also, there is also an assumption that the power grows from the barrel of the gun. But it also has this, and I would like to enter another notion. I would call it geopolitical racketeering, and this is a kind of modus operandi in which you enter as a force, as a factor of power, that's able to use physical violence, and you try to get benefits out of this. So when you keep relations with everyone, I think it's a bargaining tool. In fact, you drive your prices up for everyone, and you make sure that everyone knows that you can go with the opposition. So you bargain. Your value gets up as a partner, and there can also be an economic benefit, side benefit for that. And I think it's also an answer to the issue that was raised in a previous panel about economic problems. How can you maintain the active global politics and be a player when your economy is not doing so great? Well, you have to make sure that you earn money on the side. So in that sense, it's very different from they think they learned from the Soviet experience. So you combine the two things, and in this. I think this is the complicated answer to the question. Thanks.
You asked about talking to everyone. What are the achievements for the future, etc. So I first of all, I do think that there are a lot of achievements, and I think it's a very smart and very right diplomacy. As I mentioned before, not all of that is due to Russian diplomacy. Part of it is thanks to others that have done a lot of mistakes. But I just will give some examples. The main issue, I think, in Russia today is economy. How do you improve the economy? So if you can have a dialogue with Saudi Arabia on oil prices, it's very important. If you can have investment of Qatar and Saudi Arabia in Russian economy, it's very important. When you go to security issues, if you can talk to Israel and Iran in Syria, even if in a situation when both sides know that you are very limited in your capabilities to fulfill the other side's interest, still both sides see a huge of importance in coming to Moscow and talking to you. I think it's a huge achievement. And at the end of the day, when I go to Europe, I hear all our real friends in Europe asking us, why do we accept the Russian involvement in Syria? And what we say is that we have to, because they are on our border and they are there and we have to talk to them. And I think this is one of the examples of why this Russian diplomacy has achieved by talking to everyone. Of course, one can come to a point where it has to make a decision. But for the time being, it is successful. Russia could stop for years the sale of the S-400 to Iran, and at the same time have good relations with Iran today and even before. So it is a complex situation, relations because of the complex situation. Thank you.
Okay, three very brief points. Dr. Suponina, thank you very much. I fully agree. Just to add to your point, I think Russia is a very interesting illustration of a very sophisticated approach to the issue of ecclesiastical diplomacy. I think people in Moscow are perfectly cognizant exactly of the tensions that exist in Russia and in the region when you are playing, if you wish, the religious card or the religious approach. And I think so far, at least until now, the Russian approach has been characterized by what I would call reasonable sufficiency when it comes to ecclesiastical diplomacy. It is seeking, not necessarily finding, but it is definitely seeking a golden range between not abusing the role of faith and religion, but also not underutilizing it. And I think the Syrian case is a great illustration of it. An example of military police is a great point. I would even add that was important, that is not only that it's predominantly Muslim Sunni, which is tremendously important for Syria. And at the same time, Russian Orthodox Church is is tremendously active in what is called межрелигиозный dialogue, interreligious dialogue, engaging also senior Muslim leaders in the region, in Russia and elsewhere. These are usually joint enterprises, which is a tremendously sophisticated approach to religious diplomacy. That's point number one. Point number two, also benefiting from Dr. Suponina's reference to Alexei Vasilyev and his book on Russian policy in the Middle East. And now, General Brom, it's a response to you about to what extent this is a cynical or instrumental use of Dr. Suponina, as you of course know, but people in the audience don't know, this is actually their rework of his previous book, and the title of the previous book is Russian Policy in the Middle East from Messianism to Pragmatism. And Vasilyev is the leading Russian, one of the leading Russian Orientalists or Vostokovedy, actually is the best in outlining this very sophisticated and interesting combination between Messianism and pragmatism in the Russian, Tsarist, Soviet and post-Soviet foreign policy. And I think that actually General Brom answers your question. I think that it's a genuine belief. And like any country around the world, Russian leadership, we can discuss it and debate the extent of it, but it's the leadership or their circle of decision makers that are sharing certain values, norms, and are acting on certain ideational orienters. And today, Russian national identity and Russian national ideology is more than ever before situated with religious ideas. So for this very reason, I think it matters. It's exactly like people would question to what extent Zionist ideology is cynical or instrumental. It's pretty much the same. And I think the answer is, I'm not making the comparison, but I think it's a good intellectual exercise to conduct. And finally, you're actually asking the question, which is at the heart of the debate of international relations scholars that are doing work on state-church relations in Russia. I would argue that to portray the Russian Orthodox Church as Kremlin's, if you wish, obedient servant or subordinated to the Kremlin's will, or speaking about the Byzantine symphony of equals would be oversimplification. The symphony of interest in a sense that in return for the privileges the Russian Orthodox Church is providing the Kremlin with ideological support. That's a very simple way to look into it. I think it's more precise to talk about some sort of partnership or competitive model where areas of convergence of interests coexist with the areas of divergence of interests. On the surface, of course, the Church and the Kremlin are on the very good terms, but actually I think the patriarchy would collaborate genuinely with the Kremlin when their ecclesiastical and the state interests are in line. The moment when they conduct some sort of tension or divergence, I think the patriarchy might be more resolved. However, whatever the nature, General Brom, of the relationship between state and church today, I think the general consensus among scholars is that more keeps state and church together in Russia today rather than drives them apart. Their views and values and norms mostly converge, making them allies that share similar values, similar norms, and similar views on the issues of domestic and international policy, rhetorically and in reality.